Well, first of all, thank you very much, Charles, for the opportunity to talk, and with Minas Associates behind that. That's marvelous, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity, because I do think the Arctic is a region that's going to be of importance. Is going to be an increasing importance in our lifetimes. So I thought what I'm really going to do, I'm afraid, folks, it's a little bit of a tour de horizon, so I'm whipping through fairly quickly, but I'm trying to do that really because I want to get as many questions at the end as possible. But it's probably not what you're going to expect, and it's certainly not what in the academic literature or some of the policy that you have heard about. And I certainly have a slightly different view of what is happening there, mainly because of my experience there, my interest in Russian affairs, and I speak the language, and the occupations I've had over the years that draw different conclusions than most. So, but anyway, I think we're short of time, so I will crack on. So Charles, if we could have the first slide. I mean, what I really want, in fact, I think there's one before that actually, is the title slide, because I just wanted to say something there. I think we're jumping some, there's not, all right, okay. So I suppose what I'm saying is that Sino-Russian relations in the Eurasian Arctic, is it a partnership or alliance? I'm saying straight away, it is a partnership, but it's a geo-economic one. But I think it will move and is moving towards a strategic alliance. The question therefore is, under what circumstances and when would this happen? And perhaps the glib answer, but nonetheless, there's an aspect to it, is when the United States says it is a strategic alliance. But the more thorough view, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not the United States government, is actually, I think they will consider, it will become a geostrategic alliance when they begin to consider a decoupling from the West. And I emphasize that, not us decoupling from the China or Russia. I think quite the opposite. I think that it can only be a strategic alliance once they feel strong enough that they can decouple from the West economically and from the point of view of technology, especially, and that's a point I'll come back to. So if we have the next slide then, Charles, that's great. The points I really want to make here is about the Arctic definition. Previous to that, sorry, Charles, let's stay on the map for people so they can familiarize themselves with the territory. Those are the 8 Arctic Council countries represented by the Arctic Council, and fairly obvious who they are. The big one is Russia in the yellow, as you can see, and just beside it, the United States from Alaska. But the point I want to make here is one of Arctic definition, and we are not defining it well. Traditionally, it was defined by the tree line that disappears the further north you go, by the latitude, the actual mathematical latitude of the Arctic, and average summer temperatures, etc. But now there's a lot more areas of definition. But what is important for us today is to understand that essentially there has been traditionally 2 views of the Arctic. There is the North American Arctic, which you can see on the map is the United States and Canada, especially Canada with its vast territory, and the European Arctic. The point I'm pushing today is that we can no longer think about that solely. What we really need to look at that European Arctic and consider it now the Eurasian Arctic. And certainly the United States is looking more at the Asian side of the Eurasian Arctic than Europe, and that's something we need to catch up with and also coordinate with the United States. Now, the second reason why this is important that we define this is that within the European Arctic, now spreading to the Eurasian, the real major issues in the Arctic are in the European Arctic, not so much in the North American. And those are the obvious ones of hydrocarbons, obviously nuclear weapons still there in terms of submarine forces, the Northern Sea route running along the coast of Russia, the indigenous people, issues of climate, issues of fisheries, issues of fresh water, and of course, overall issue of governance of the Arctic, which is being challenged and we'll come to. So what I'm really getting at is that we need to have a policy, first of all, in the United Kingdom especially, but elsewhere in the West about what exactly is the Arctic. And I'm pushing with my government and through them to the United States government that one of the things we need to do in terms of looking at the Sino-Russian relationship is that we need to look at this at the Arctic in terms of the Eurasian Arctic now, because it really is spreading, and Russia being essentially 85% of the NSR being Russian means that they are the key country linking Europe with Asia. So that's the point I'd like to start there. So if we have the next slide, please, Charles. So the question is, I mean, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but you get the idea, especially with relations out of Ukraine at the moment. So you get the idea. But the question, what I'm really saying is there going to be a fight there? I don't think so. But is it a theater, along with the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia, which is the American classification? Most certainly, it is becoming one. And the advent of China on its own would not be. The presence of Russia already would not be. But the combination most certainly is. So Russia is the biggest Arctic player, and its importance to China is that it is the vehicle by which they can link Eurasia. In other words, from the EU economic bloc to the Chinese economic bloc on one continent, where incidentally, as you all know, America is not on the same continent. The only superpower in history that is not Eurasian is America. Up until now, that didn't matter. Now it's beginning to matter with China's rise. So the second point to come across about here is that because Russia is so fundamentally a part of the Arctic and is the leading Arctic nation from the point of view of research, institutional knowledge, territory, science, developments, the Northern Sea route, etc., that the way to think about the China-Russia relationship is that China is being sponsored by Russia in the Arctic. And as we all know, sponsorship can be withdrawn. So Russia does have a little bit of a stick here, whilst China has an awful lot of carrot in terms of investment and technology and all the rest of it. So if you want to understand China's role in the Arctic, it is critical that you understand the Sino-Russian relationship, because in some ways, everything is checked by Russia, agreed between Xi and Putin at a very high level. And at a practical level, icebreakers and all the rest of it, the Russians are experts at that and can very easily judge the competence of China operations in the region. So what does China want? Well, China's want is presence, like any superpower. It has to be in the Arctic now. And this logical thinking is there's enormous climate change going on there, environmental change. And they say, therefore, there will be economic change, which indeed there is, and that will lead to societal changes, which indeed there are. And when those things happen, geopolitical opportunities emerge. And if you are not present, you cannot take advantage of those geopolitical opportunities. So China's purpose is very clear. They must, number one, have presence. And the route to presence in an area that they don't know, which is environmentally hostile, is Russia, because they have 50% of the Arctic in terms of territory alone, and that is valuable to China. So the Sino-Russian aim in the Arctic, in very broad terms, is creating essentially new spaces. And by this, I'm going to be talking about this, is that this is not a multipolar world that they actually think is going to happen and the West does. I'm suggesting it's a multi-regional world. One reason for that is if you declare a multipolar world, especially in the Arctic, America will take action. It will not tolerate that at this stage in its development. But if you have a multi-regional world, well, that sounds more reasonable. It sounds less threatening. So they're creating new spaces, new regions, which they economically support through Belt and Road. And as we'll see through technology, especially in the Arctic, in terms of linkage, virtual distances being reduced as a result. And therefore, once they have these areas, then they can actually see the economic, the political opportunities from it. So there's very much, the first thing I would say that the aim really is to create new spaces of which the Arctic is one, and in particular, the Pacific Arctic region, which we'll talk about in a moment. They are therefore, in a sense, like great powers of the 19th century and with spheres of interest, but this time they have technology, which links these regions, and they have finance, which means they don't necessarily have to be actually present. And this is a difficulty for the United States going forward, in that they can link disparate regions that are not contiguous and that they are linked by technology. And against the vastness of Russia and equally the vastness of China, this makes a big difference. So they're doing this by harnessing technology in the Arctic, or making best use of technology, but especially using the Belt and Road. And I'm calling this system of regionalism building around the world, but we see it in the Arctic, we see it around Turkey, Syria, places like that. I'm calling it polycentric regionalism. And it's a move away from unipolarity into polycentric regionalism. And before you know it, when things are being done with technology and Belt and Road, suddenly that is the route then to multipolarity, which is when it becomes a strategic alliance and considers decoupling. Now, all this experimentation, in my view, A lot of it is going in the Arctic because Russia feels safe there. It is powerful in that part of the world. And China, in terms of physicality there, working with Russia, also feels safe in that region. And the Northern Sea route is not particularly open to the US Navy at the moment. It could be, of course, but outside of hostilities, the United States and everybody else takes it rather steadily there for obvious reasons. So we're not looking at a multipolar world forming up there. We're looking at the formation of a multi-regional world. And one of those regions is the Pacific Arctic, for reasons we'll come to. So if you like, that is what one of the purposes of the alliances. The next slide, please, Charles. Why care about the Arctic? Yeah. Well, the reason for that is very simple, is that there are four major reasons. Number one is the climate. In terms of observation, data gathering, and understanding the environment, because of its high latitude location, the Arctic is vital. So some of the best scientists and a lot of the science about environmental change and climate is occurring there. That is a very important reason why we should care about it. Strategically, of course, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, those nuclear weapons never went away. So it is still important strategically. In terms of hydrocarbon, rare earth materials, especially now, that is becoming another very important part in terms of the strategic interest. And thirdly, of course, the development of the Northern Sea route as a possible global slot in the 21st century is also of critical importance. Thirdly, though, I think myself, one of the importance of it is that we should take very much note of the Arctic Council, how it works, because this seems to be an international forum that at present is dealing with essentially three superpowers or former superpowers or future superpowers, namely China, Russia, and the United States there, and various other countries with complex problems. And the Arctic Council has been governing in an especially good way. And I think, therefore, that's a very good model as to perhaps how we could continue in the future. So that's a very important thing because it hits on the issue of governance. And one of the things that China is doing in the Arctic is slowly undermining that governance and suggesting alternative means. So the Arctic Council, in my view, has to remain sacrosanct and must be supported at all times. And the fourth reason is we've got no choice, is that the United States in the last couple of years have announced that the three most important strategic regions in the world, the 21st century for them at least, and everybody else no doubt, is the Indo-Pacific, Eurasia and the Arctic. Well, the Arctic is there now and it's also part of Eurasia. So I think that's a statement to the obvious. So is it the next theatre? Well, I suppose the answer to that is the Sino-Russian relationship is quietly taking on Eurasia, including the Arctic. Whilst everybody's attention is really focused on the Indo-Pacific, they are working very hard across Eurasia, in Eurasia, and as part of that, the Arctic as well. And one of the areas that we'll come to, why they're so interested in the Arctic, especially the Chinese, is because of its high latitude and the advantages that has with low orbiting satellites. So in other words, space is an aspect of this. So is China a strategic threat in this relationship? The answer is no, not yet. If it does become one, it will be because it has to work with Russia in the Arctic. So the implications are that it can't be a great power there in the Arctic, only if it works with Russia, because of this idea of sponsorship, because Russia has enormous leverage there and has assets that they desperately need, and that they just, essentially, they don't have the knowledge yet, or the management, or some of the technology to get over it. So the method of how this will work, the Sino-Russian relationship there, is really one based on, obviously, investment, and that means the Belt and Road investment that is going on there. The only project that China has classified as Belt and Road, in fact, it's in the oil and gas industry, which we'll come to. And that is strategic in that that oil and gas depends on the development of the Northern Sea route, which in turn suggests that China and Russia become sea powers in the Arctic, and also the linkage then between Europe and Asia. So that's the first thing. The second aspect of it, how they'll do it, is through technology and the idea of working in space, celestial space. I don't mean in spaces on the ground. And the third thing is through regulation and governance of, or regulation, so I should say, of space and technology, which leads to governance. And China is trying to make sure that any regulation coming in is on the basis of their norms and practices and understandings of IR. So that is a very powerful governance tool. But all of that needs okay. So Belt and Road, technology in space, and regulation of technology are the three ways in for China. Get the next slide, please, Charles. So the situation in the Arctic is changing. let me put it this way, as far as the Belt and Road is concerned, as I say, this is supporting the Novatek Yamal project. That's the only one at the moment, the Belt and Road, and it's called actually the Ice Silk Road Fund. It's a subset of Belt and Road, but it is Belt and Road. Now, the point about that is Chinese people have inadvertently sort of suggested to me on visits to Cambridge is that this is an economic governance tool because it is so powerful, because it has been used, for instance, the Northern Sea Route for the infrastructure of navigation, search and rescue, emergency response, et cetera, et cetera. What the Chinese are quietly saying is, well, you know, what do you need the Arctic Council for if you've got the economic governance provided by the Belt and Road into the European Arctic? Point one. The United States view is slightly understands that and actually goes one step further in terms of strategic view, that it is actually Belt and Road is a physical and virtual and financial platform for technology development and activities in space, especially over the Arctic, the European Arctic. And therefore, when you think about Russia withdrawing from the ISS some months ago and joining the Chinese, you can begin to join the dots of where this is going. So Belt and Road is an economic governance threat to the Arctic Council, potentially, not necessarily, but potentially. But it is also quite clearly, as far as the United States is concerned, it is a platform for space activities and the introduction of sophisticated dual-use technologies, GPS, or the Chinese equivalent, Baidu, which, as we know, is very good for navigation, but it's also pretty good for navigation of targeting nuclear missiles. Now, from the Chinese point of view, if you think there's insufficient evidence for that, I read a recent commentary on that about a Chinese general suggesting that if you are positioned over the Arctic in space, then you have governance over 2 oceans and 3 continents. So you can see the Sino-Russian prize here, that Russia to some extent will go along with this. But as the technology side takes a greater grip there, and we'll see this, the effect it has in the international political economy and in the Arctic, you can see why Russia will go along because of the benefits that it will get economically. But certainly China is interested that if you have control over space in the Arctic, because of low orbiting satellite, that aspect, some technical aspects, then effectively you have governance over 2 major oceans and 3 continents. That concerns the United States. And that operationality and how it will manifest will to some extent happen in the Pacific Arctic as well, where we're not looking certainly in Western Europe. So as an aside, if you look at something like the Chinese Arctic Observatory, that they have a venture with in Iceland, one of the things they'll be looking at is the Northern Lights. Well, those that are from the physical sciences background will understand why they do that, because one of the things why people are interested in the Northern Lights is that the physics of that is the nearest thing we have on Earth that replicates what happens when a nuclear weapon goes off. So you ask yourself, China in Iceland with an observatory looking at the Northern Lights. So there are a lot of very strategic aspects going on here that are not fully understood, but Russia is very interested in this technology as well. And of course, Russia is very strong in STEM, and China is very keen to understand the institutional acquisition of STEM, which Russia has over many, many years. And obviously its institutional knowledge of space, its institutional knowledge of Arctic, and its institutional knowledge of strategic matters and weapons. And this all comes together in a place called the Arctic. Right, so if we could have the next slide, please, Charles. I don't want to go too much about this, but the one I want to look at is on the right there. You'll see halfway down, IP, International Political Economy, Technology and Service Economy. This is how this, in my view, is occurring. What is happening is we know that the costs of labor are reducing in the modern economy because of technology. We know that things like 3D printing are having a massive effect on manufacturing. And the net result of this, and I'm hugely simplifying here, is that we're now the acknowledgement that we're all onshoring again, that the requirement to offshore is lessening because of the less role of labor in this. But the important point is that you can have where you now manufacture is now where you market and sell. And as the center of economic gravity has moved from mid-Atlantic towards Asia, and global value chains are shortened, but they're now a lot of them connecting it in Asia. and there is a pivot of the United States and Russia, less importantly, obviously Russia, but nonetheless, there is a pivot to the east. This means that a lot of the manufacturing side of life will alter, and the creation of markets at regional level, remember what I was saying about polycentric regionalism, is suddenly you can have an economy at a regional level of scale that is international. And actually, obviously in Asia, then you have a massive population as well. So this idea now is that we need to be abroad in terms of the ownership of both the manufacturing and the marketing. So companies will be going abroad for these sorts of reasons. Now, one of the effects of this is that here at Cambridge, a lot of the economists looking at this is that you have a steady idea of deglobalization. And in fact, from 2008, when you looked at the critical global integration index, one of them, the critical one, was international trade ratio to global GDP. And by 2008, we were up to about 55%. It's dropped 10% since then, and it's never recovered. And at the same time as the growth in international trade used to be double that of the growth of overall global GDP, that's now equating the same. So the suggestion now that we're literally traded out. But the point I'm trying to make here is that because of technology, 3D technology, because of shortening global value chains, because of manufacturing ability, and at a regional level, and the finance that China can provide, that the idea of building power in the 21st century is moving more towards, or could be moving towards, an idea of regionalization, not as opposed to deglobalization, but in step with in step with what seems to be incipient deglobalization. So, what could we think about that? Well, the definition of power there is therefore changing, which Sino-Russian relationship seems to have understood pretty quickly. And so in the Arctic, technology, for instance, can be dual use. The latency factor is fantastic for big data and AI, but it's also pretty good in the military aspect as well in that part of the world. And therefore the distances also, the huge distances involved in Russia and China, time and space, that can be alleviated as well by virtual connectivity via technology. So the technology, let's go back to this, what the real point is. If as a result of this idea of deglobalization, regionalization for the reasons I've stated, then what we're looking at is the growth of the service sector. And that is where global GDP is in the 21st century. Manufacturing is still there, of course, but the real financial advantages are in service sector. And there's more value added that can be done through that form of GDP than perhaps manufacturing. But the point about it is that if you look at the US trade war with China, it's about trade, and it certainly is. But on the other hand, what underpins trade is technology. And therefore, technology is the critical thing that has been sought after. And the technology is being developed now, as we'll see, between Russia and China, technology and innovation programs, ISS, as we see in the International Space Station, hypersonic weapons. You can see how this technology is being used, certainly at the military level, but also economically. And therefore the battlefield between the United States and China is one of them really about technology, because if you have technology, you get the service economy. If you get the service economy in the 21st century, you get global GDP. That's the battle that's going on. And some of it, some of it is being demonstrated, as I say, that what's going on in the Arctic at the moment and behind the scenes. So how would this IPE and the center of economic gravity, the sort of right-hand column of the points here on the slide, affect us? Well, what we're looking at is that there's a move from sovereignty to sovereign rights. Everybody's clear, who owns the borders and boundaries in the Arctic. What we're interested in the sovereign rights is who's allowed to go across those borders, who is allowed access into the region, who is allowed to exploit resources on the seabed of the Arctic. How can we form joint ventures there with it? What is the implication for indigenous people? How can we work on this from a climate and environmental protection and sustainable point of view? These are the issues that Sino-Russia is ahead of us in the Arctic and doing. So their methodology is not necessarily military, it's misinterpreted. It is actually geo-economic, of which the military is part. And space is critical for this because it equals, in simple terms, aside from the strategic aspect and the weapons, it's about governance. Because if you control space, as Elon Musk is demonstrating, and you're using space-based means for mass media IoT and all the rest of it, then that is a threat to China, because you now have Western billionaires who are actually competing for media influence and governance by space-based means. So this obviously worries the Chinese, but this is why they're so keen to be into the Arctic and be in space over the Arctic. All right. If you in that sense, then this move from region as we'll see in the oil and gas side, that this idea then in oil and gas in Yamal and Novatek is sort of an example of regionalization by gasification into the Pacific Arctic area. That is what is occurring, and that is polycentric regionalism in action, creating the Pacific Arctic economic area, which then leads to geopolitical advantages of actually having an area that is politically heavily influenced by China and Russia without actually having troops there or any manifest signs of power. It's simply putting these things in place with BRI, technology, the Northern Sea route, and a geo-economic approach to collaboration between the two of them, which at the moment I think confuses us because we keep coming back with a military opposition and a geopolitical view of how to take Russia and China on, whereas they're saying we're using geo-economics, but the output will be geopolitical. So have the next slide, please, Charles. The points here on the objects and objectives is that this is a challenge to United States status. This is very important in the Arctic because this means they're not trying to take on the United States militarily head on. They will get defeated. So what you do is you pick away at the United States status. Well, in the Arctic, you know, they're quite quiet in that part of the area of the United States mainly because they don't have to be. Other than that, in terms of resources, they don't need Alaska in terms of natural resources. They have this role, the strategic role, of course. But China and Russia will not take them on under those terms. What they do is take them on under technology and investment and space. And those are the clothes of the superpower. And if you show Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic that you're undermining that they're not quite as important as they thought they were, then people say, well, what is America then? If it's not leading in space, if it's not leading in technology, if it's not got control of the NSR, if it's not got the governance ability working in on the Arctic Council, then what is it? Why do we follow it? So it's a more subtle view of how they're approaching this. So they're building these new world alliances to that end of reducing US status by getting into bed, as we well know, with Sweden and Finland and countries like that, and also talking to places like Japan and South Korea who have Arctic interests, shipbuilding and oil and gas and things like that. So they're slowly working both sides of Eurasia with the Scandi countries on one side and Japan, South Korea, etc. on the other. But they're looking at the linkage between the two, how those with their technology, oil and gas investment can begin to underpower the status of the United States, not its direct power, but its status. So they leave people in the end to come to their own conclusions that America is not that powerful in space, nor in technology, nor in domination of the high seas. So, as I said, this dominate space idea that if you could do that, you can then dominate 2 oceans and three continents. You can see where this is coming from. So on the right-hand side, then on where I put the adopt the geo-economic strategy, what this does is part of that is this deglobalization and move to regionalization, especially in the Arctic, with the creation of the Pacific Arctic. The methodology is in this case is regionalization by gasification, literally putting pipelines down, having strategic relations between Northeast Asian LNG market and Russia, with China in the middle of that, of course, and perhaps the creation of a hub in the future. And then the use of both technology and Belt and Road, and the institutions and regulations that go around them, which we fail to attend in the West because they're rather boring, but the Chinese go to, and they're looking heavily at regulation of technology. And that's the way they put their norms and own perceptions of how to run the world fit in, and without us watching it. And because of the potency of technology in terms of social media, that is catastrophic for us unless we look at it very carefully. And you can see that beginning with some of the campaigns that China has in the Arctic, but they're carefully managed by Russia for the reasons mentioned. So this regionalization by gasification therefore creates a market and a geographical space in which then the Sino-Russian relationship began to make headway with the geopolitical output, which is the formation of a new region. So we're looking really at the end game here of one of governance of the region over a regional sphere of interest that these re-emerging great powers are taking on. Okay, the next slide, please, Charles. So these really shouldn't be said to be scenarios. They're actually ongoing. They should really be project 1, 2, and 3. So I'll just go through them quickly. The critical one, of course, is, and you may be aware, is Novatek's Yamal operation. What is impressive about this is that with Chinese funding now, Belt and Road and all the rest of it, in spite of sanctions, what is important politically is Putin can say that in spite of the sanctions, I've got an international consortium here and we're going great guns. We've got the French here, we've got the Germans here, we've got the Japanese here, we've got the Chinese here, we've got the South Koreans here. We've got everybody here in spite of sanctions, and we're doing very well, thank you. So it's quite an important showcase in terms of putting two fingers up, as it were, to the West and the sanctions. That may not last. But they have the management and the technology. This is improving enormously. And they have a lot of substitution, which they have done as a result of the original sanctions. So in terms of gravity-based platforms and all the rest of it, they actually have come out with some very good technological solutions to the appalling environmental region there in terms of difficulty. They have Chinese financing there, as I said. Arctic LNG 2 will go primarily to China, and there is huge Chinese financing in that. And that's why also you notice that the Chinese are very interested in the Northern Sea route in terms of Belt and Road investment, because obviously that's the midstream taken care of if they can get involved in that. Koreans and Finnish on the shipbuilding side for icebreakers and for carriers, that's going on. And of course, favorable investment by the Russian government in terms of tax breaks and all the rest of it that they could have. The formation of the Zvezda shipyard on the Pacific side, basically there's a little internal games there with Rosneft and one of the Siloviki, but essentially saying that we're building now, in spite of sanctions, we're now building a shipbuilding capability for the Arctic. And some of the latest orders from Novatek actually go to Zvezda. The truth of the matter is it's not technically that great, and that quietly Novatek is subcontracting to Korean and Japanese shipbuilders in the Zvezda shipyard, but nonetheless you get the drift. But this is a massive investment. Pipeline gases, as some of you will know, is gradually losing market share to LNG, and Northeast Asia, China, Japan and South Korea is the biggest LNG market in the world. And Russia is sitting there beside it with the biggest gas reserves in the world and control of the Northern Sea route by which it can deliver it. So you can see there's a huge game going on here. So the difficulty is that if we wanted to have a go, as it were, at the Sino-Russian relationship in the Yamal for LNG, the bankers are going to say, well, the trouble is this is a great project. I mean, we have the biggest gas reserves in the world. We have increasing market share by Russia, Yamal LNG, into Northeast Asia. The two biggest players are really Russia supplier, and China eventually will be the number one. At the moment is number two consumer of LNG in the area. And we see now the polar codal on the Northern Sea route, which means that our investment in the midstream is now more assured, that there's actually some navigation there, ports of safe haven. There's icebreaker fleets that the Russians have, others are building as well. There's more online through Zvezda. So the whole project is looking very viable, and it'll be very difficult to undermine it. And as a result of this, the bottom line is that Russia now slowly has emerged as the fourth biggest LNG player in the world, following Australia, United States, and Qatar. And the difficulty is that going into Northeast Asia, especially with China now, will be very difficult in this Pacific Arctic region, because everything's up and set, and relations between Australia and China and between the United States and China are not that great, and relations between Qatar and Russia are quietly very good. So you can see that there could be a grabbing of a new LNG market, a hub there, which is very much between Russian supply and Chinese consumption, that eventually could probably come off the dollar. We have a spot market there, and then we could see all sorts of developments about this in terms of polycentric regionalism. One, of course, is that when Putin says, I'm going to join the Arctic Ocean with the West Pacific and the Indian Ocean some years ago, people laughed. What he meant was, if I get this deal right, I can start doing LNG swap deals with the UAE or with Iran to feed UAE on our behalf. So connectivity and linkage has a massive effect, therefore, on containment strategy for the United States in terms of, because you're up against technology and you have no pipelines, you're having ships that are going along territorial waters in the Northern Sea route and down to the down to China and the Western Pacific. So if we have the next slide, please, Charles. We've only got two or three more slides to go, folks, and then I'm hoping we can stop. I realize I'm romping through this, so there's probably quite a lot of questions, but gaps, but I hope the questions will give me the opportunity to fill some of those gaps. So we come here to the vision of the creation of Pacific Arctic. The point I want to look at there is when I mentioned 2/3 of the way down, Belt and Road, technology and innovation. One of the things the Russians have done in the last few years is they've got formally looked at STEM and technology, and they've set up a technology innovation program. And this is everything from the institutions, the best Russian and Chinese institutions looking at STEM, right through to technology, and they're emphasizing big data, AI, and robotics, unsurprisingly. But that is a huge, in my view, signal also of, number one, intent, and number two, trust building. The Russians, unbelievably, are putting their own OS system into Chinese mobile networks, and you can think of the security implications of that, at the same time as China is putting 5G into Moscow. These are not insignificant things that are going on, and they're operationalized, as you see, in some of the things that are going on in the Arctic, in terms of the difficulty of terrain there, the difficulty of communications, and that's where a lot of the application is going. So if you look at this technology innovation program, the way I look at it is the first phase is really looking at economic technologies that China can actually monetize and try to get parity to the United States. And they'll probably get somewhere near it in the future at some stage, but that's what they're looking at, is the economic. The second phase really is Chinese within this technology innovation program, is really Chinese looking at the regulation. And they're quite right about that, because without the regulation, these are not international products that they can sell, and they therefore can't really get a great market share. So the emphasis in phase 2 of the TIP, as it's called, Technology Innovation Program, is really on the regulation. But the third phase is the military side and innovations. That's obviously somewhat ongoing, as we know, but it's not the emphasis. And my view, therefore, is that this is a critical aspect, because until you have phase 2, which is economic parity technology with the United States for economic reasons, and you have some level of regulation and institutionalization that China controls, it is only at that stage, not the military stage of the application of TIP, but at those economic and regulatory positions that China and Russia consider decoupling from the West. Now, the question is, well, what does Russia get out of this? The answer from when I talk to Russians is, Tim, you've got to understand the scale of the finances that China are paying for. So it is monetary. The second thing is going back to my point about service sector and the movement into the Arctic, and this region, how they'll exploit it through space, that aspect of which technology underpins the service sector, is they said that if we win this battle with the United States over technology, which is supposedly about trade, but it's about technology, that means that that technology underpins the service economy. And that is where global GDP is, and that's where the superpowers. And if we can stick with China, we provide the STEM, the institutional knowledge of space, the Arctic, for instance, the strategic aspects, and China brings Belt and Road and technology, and we stick with them, then we are going to be a powerful secondary player. And that's the strategic goal. And we can see it, as I say, in things like the NSR and the oil and gas exploitation in Yamal, how much China is investing in that. They have now got equity in that. And you can notice that China's emphasis, once they've got equity, they're now looking at the midstream aspect of the industry. So they're looking at the shipbuilding side, the viability of the NSR, Baidu applications for navigation in line with OPEC. So this is where we're heading. So that is the point, I think, where you'll see that this decoupling is once the technology is in place to financially, economically compete with the United States, and once the regulation side is in, that is another aspect, and then they can consider decoupling. But a lot of that will come out of, believe it or not, the Arctic area, because of the positioning of the Arctic space over the Arctic, where there's the opportunity to influence those things, as Elon Musk has already shown himself by space-based media applications through satellites. So have the next slide, please, Charles. So a summary of this then is that what's the relationship there in this Arctic area? Well, there's institutional knowledge, which Russia provides. There's the geography. Russia covers Eurasia. And if you want to link it between two trade blocks, you've got to go through Russia, and therefore the Northern Sea route. The points I'm making about the technology aspect, and therefore the ability to have a regionalization, geo-economic approach to a new world order, as opposed to a multipolar one or the present unipolar one, Okay, a lot of that thinking comes from the STEM research that technology enhances and allows to happen in terms of how the economies will develop after this, as a result of this. And to some extent, Russia also is the battering ram, so it allows China to observe how the West, responds to issues like Ukraine. From the Chinese point of view, though, in the terms of they bring the technology. They will bring the technology. They bring the dollars through the Belt and Road in terms of the Northern Sea Route development, its infrastructure, which is critical for Russia to develop its own Arctic region. It needs that Northern Sea Route. And China wants it, A, for gas LNG exports, but also as an approach into the EU. And another aspect of this is that there is a creeping alliance there and trying to split the Quad relationship in the Pacific Arctic region. That is very useful indeed. And the linkage, I think, that we need to take is between the Scandinavian countries and of the European Arctic and those Asian countries, but pushing alliances by giving them cheap gas, for instance, sharing some of the technology, Chinese suggestions to Japan. Recently, Rosneft's Sechin said, why don't we join up Hokkaido to Sakhalin Island, and then we'll link that to the mainland, and then we'll put your goods on the train on the Trans-Siberian to Europe for Japan. These are the ways that they're working at trying to encourage some sort of more favorable view of the Sino-Russian relationship. Okay, the next slide. I think we'll leave that. The one I'd like to go back to, Charles, if we can go back a couple, and we went to the Sino-Russian projects in the Arctic, if we can find that. It was after that. It's titled Sino-Russian Projects in the Arctic. I looked at the oil and gas one just briefly, but there was a second one that I want to talk about, is really space, and I think I've said enough about that. What's actually happening on the space side, and that is a multi-dimensional movement into the region. But so the Northern Sea Route and the gas, if you see, is linking Europe left and right, east and west. Space is multi-dimensional. And the third area is an integration between what's known as the Dongbei regions of China, which are the three principal provinces bordering up to the Chinese-Russian Far East, or one of them is, and the linkage to that with the Russian Far East, and a movement going north-south towards the Arctic. So if you look at Yakutsk, there's a railway going up to there. In Yakutsk, the Russian Geographical Society, with Chinese support, are looking at riverine passage up to places like the Lena River, and coming out in places like Tixi on the Northern Sea Route. So you can see there's a drive towards the Arctic. The point about this is that if this comes off, along with the Northern Sea Route aspect and deliveries, what effectively is happening is in that region, that regionalization, that Pacific Arctic region, is Russia is effectively supporting the Chinese hinterland. And you wonder why the last 18 months or so, China's been so aggressive in South China Sea and East China Sea. One of the reasons why it wasn't before is it had to protect its hinterland. So essentially now you have got Russia, to some extent, early days, but the infrastructure is going in place where Russia is actually behind it, is in the hinterland, linking it. Now, this is the last point I really make. I have got some American solutions, but that might come up in the questions. The last point I make is that there is a view that China and Russia don't like each other, don't trust each other. It's absolutely right. The question is, what are they doing about it? And my view is that we are being rather lazy in the West, policy-wise and academically, saying, well, what are they doing? And my view is that combination of space projects, oil and gas projects, and north-south linking integration projects between the Dongbei, Russian Far East, and then into the Arctic, what they are all about is trust building. Every one of those projects in of itself is not hypercritical, but they are all confidence building measures. So what you see is a steady movement from a local project in the Russian Far East of no value. Then we're looking at railway projects. Then we're looking at oil and gas. Then we're looking at Putin saying, I might be able to build a ballistic missile early warning system for you guys based in that region, up in the Pacific region. And then we have the ISS, and then we have a technology innovation program. What you're seeing is a steady progress of intensifying strategic projects, starting from very tactical of no financial real interest at all, through to security of supply for China with gas, through to collaboration over space. So in of itself, this idea that there is no trust between Russia is nonsense. You do not suggest to an enemy that you might help them build a ballistic missile early warning system, or that you're taking their oil and gas from the biggest supplier in the world. So this idea of trust should be stopped. We must stop thinking about this. There is trust there. And what they do is they test, it works, they progress the sensitivity of the project, they progress the investment, they progress the strategic aspect of the project over time. And there is a steady escalation there of trust, and that is done by confidence building measure. And the TIP, the Technology Innovation Program, has been, you can see, rolled out in the Arctic, aimed mainly at space, but also at oil and gas aspects, and the Northern Sea route infrastructure development is very much part of that. So I think I'd like to sort of finish it there, really. As I say, there's an awful lot of background I had to go in to show a little bit about the Arctic, if you like, but I can talk about more specific questions as we go forward. I've left this thing, Charles, we go back one. That is just after that. That is really a summary of some of what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to go through that, but in the background, you can read that while you're thinking perhaps of some questions that you may want to ask me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. You've covered an enormous amount of material there. We have a question here. In all this talk about Eurasian Arctic, does Canada, with its geographical interest in the Arctic, merely serve as a peg for the US? Or will we see Canada becoming a target of Sino-Russian interest, or is Canada simply too weak to have much of a relationship?
I don't think it's a question of weakness. As I said, one of the things I was careful to point out is if you look at the major issues of international order issues, environmental, societal, they usually occur, they are mainly in the European Arctic. So that's the first reason. Secondly, the predominance of Russia is in the European Arctic. Third, the creation of a possible new SLOC, a maritime SLOC, the NSR, is in the European Arctic. Hydrocarbons are there. So the question is that it's not irrelevant. From a defense point of view and from an experience of how to operate in the Arctic, Canada is absolutely vital. And from a military point of view and from a point of view of understanding the Arctic culture, which is hugely important in such a difficult environment, it is absolutely critical. But it cannot, its input is not as much as some other countries because of the nature of the geopolitical, economic, social, environmental issues that just geography is such that it does. The third point I would make is not asked, but I have to be fairly brutal. I mean, I worked in the Caspian oil projects back in the 90s, and at the end of the day, and the banking people in the audience will know well about this, if you come up with two projects that are equally good, in terms of shall we go over through Canada or through Russia in terms of linking Eurasia, they look at the economics of it and they will only finance one of them. And at the moment, the bankers would probably, in spite of the political relations, would probably be more minded to finance the Northeast Passage, i.e. Through Russia, than the Northwest Passage through Canada. So that's a third reason that Canada's contribution is by no means limited, but it is very specific at what it can do. And through no fault of its own, it's not that involved in some of the issues like glacier melt in Greenland and Iceland, for example, although their knowledge is vastly required in terms of knowing the Arctic better than other people in Europe.
Okay, I just want to ask a question about Norway. While we do, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and also just remind people that if they want to ask questions, they can do so in the chat function. At the moment, we've only had 2 questions, so hopefully we'll have some more. So what is Norway's position as a European country with the longest non-Russian European Arctic border?
I mean, Norway is critical to this. The Norwegians are a critical member of the Arctic Council, but the other thing is that geographically they're close to Russia, and secondly, they have had long and very good relations with it. I mean, some 10 or 15 years ago, after 50 years of a dispute in the Barents Sea about territorial boundaries rather, between Russia and Norway, there was a breakthrough. So there's very much, certainly there's a Russian respect for Norway as an Arctic country in terms of its institutional knowledge, the way it behaves, its attitude in terms of it's very discursive in the Arctic Council, in its environmental record, and all the rest of it. And I think perhaps until latterly there was a lot of respect, I believe, from Norway towards Russia at that level, that these were a serious Arctic country that they had to take into consideration. I mean, it is difficult now because obviously Norway is an Arctic, is a NATO member, and also because of the oil and gas aspect, which obviously probably the best operator in the Arctic region, North American and European, were the Norwegians, simply because of the experience, the safety side, and their risk management approach to hydrocarbon extraction, onshore and offshore in Arctic. So there's very much some tension there, because obviously that was working before between Russia and Norway before sanctions came in. So that's an area that has declined somewhat, but over issues of search and rescue, over Coast Guard Forum, over soft, if you like, security issues, over environmental protection, over the idea of sustainable development, then Russia and China most certainly do talk offline bilaterally, and it works very well. But it is a difficult position for them. And it's a shame that, as I say, it's one of the best conduits that we have into that region, because there was certainly used to be mutual respect at all sorts of levels. But that's where we are today. They remain fairly neutral, and the Norwegians seem to me always very pragmatic about how they go about these things from an environmental point of view, from the economic point of view, and from the geopolitical point of view.
Okay, what does the EU think about the Russia-China partnership here? Is it notably?
Sorry, I can't hear you, Charles.
Sorry. What does the EU, European Union, think about the partnership between Russia and China? Is it different from the US?
I have a personal view, and I must emphasize this. When the Sino-EU trade deal was very much in vogue, and before it sort of took a bit of a back seat, there were some obvious things going on. And you notice it also now in relations to the French and German attitude to Ukraine. If there was to be a trade route, a trade relationship between China and the EU, then the Northern Sea route, especially as the Indo-Pacific is getting quite hot for China, and Suez has been shown commercially to be vulnerable, then one of the things that was going on is that France was working in Total in the Yamal project. It had recently taken equity in the company that operates the transshipment terminals at Murmansk and Providenia. So only shipping that's under the Polar Code is allowed to go along the NSR. It's not a willy-nilly any ship. So they are in that strategic position there. They have strategic interests in LNG, in Total, and of course they're looking at the future of where that supply will go to the biggest LNG market in Northeast Asia, and from on there, obviously other economic opportunities. At the same time, Germany is interested in Arctic and the Sino-Russian relationship, because it would like to make somewhere like Hamburg, obviously the European trade hub for any Sino-EU trade deal. And if you look at Hamburg now, there's all sorts of fun and games going on there. So both Germany and France have strategic reasons to work certainly with China. And that meant, and this is the bit that's probably underestimated in a lot of the policy areas, is Putin recognized straight away that if you two guys want to work together, you're going to have to work through the Northern Sea route, and I own it. So there was a quid pro quo, which you probably see mentioned already, and everybody is aware of Nord Stream. You can bet, personal view, that Putin was sort of saying to the French and to Germans especially, if you think you're going to use the Northern Sea route, and that we will allow you, those sort of relations with China where you can build an EU trade hub in Hamburg, then we want Nord Stream 2. Now the point about this is, therefore, that Putin is positioning himself with this facilitation of France and Germany as the interlocutor between the EU and China via the Northern Sea route. So that's the challenge there. Now the difficulty is that everybody wants to get hold of the Northern Sea route. So there are some suggestions that the EU, possibly France, is leading, is saying, well, how do we, this is rather awkward because we would like more governance over the Northern Sea route. So they're looking at UNCLOS and the classification of the Northern Sea route from the point of view of the methodology by which the whole of that territory and the Arctic countries are divided up. because basically the game is, let's look at an alternative governance system which is more amenable to the Sino-Russian trade deal. So the danger of this, along with the Chinese saying similar, saying this is a zone of peace for all mankind, why do we need the Arctic Council? Between the EU saying it from one point of view and the Chinese saying the other, these are direct threats to the governance of the Arctic Council, in my opinion. And I think the EU, therefore, they might be biting off a little bit more than they can chew at this stage, because that is what actually happens then is, but de facto, the EU could be undermining the governance of the Arctic Council for economic reasons. And I don't say they do this deliberately. It might be a case of their lack of, as I mentioned before, with Canada, quite opposite, having amazing institutional knowledge of the Arctic, that EU doesn't really have that sort of level of insight into what's going on. So the EU has a view, Sino-Russian relationship, they view in the Arctic as a view to the potential for a Sino-EU trade deal, and the Northern Sea route, and therefore Putin's Russia is critical to the manifestation of that trade deal. But it does mean that they will challenge the governance of the Arctic Council so that they can have, as it were, more governance and control over that critical trade route.
Okay, one last question then. How relevant is the personal relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping to the continuation of this strategy?
Well, it is, I mean, I think he's been to see him 32 times in the last 18 months. They've had visits. There is, in the academic world, it's fairly well known that certainly at the beginning of the Novatek Yamal LNG project, when they were looking for funding after sanctions, that frankly, it was almost a freebie. Xi gave it to him. He wasn't particularly interested. He is now, as the significance of that LNG project gets going. But at the time, he just gave Putin that so that Putin could actually say, look, in spite of sanctions, I've got international participation. I've got this project up and running. So there is that sort of relationship there where they do understand each other and they are supporting each other, rather like the supposed China, Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan tie-in. So, but the point I'm making is, which is again, always back to this thing of trust. Well, when Xi and Putin go, there is an element of that. There's a danger in that for the Arctic region. And for China, the Arctic is not a priority, but it's becoming one for the reasons I mentioned and because of the opportunities it can see. So I would think that the point is, though, that these factors I made about trust, this is a strategic move by China. They now have an Arctic policy. They have now created Belt and Road for the Arctic. They have now considered the Arctic Ocean NSR, or the Arctic Ocean now, as one of their 3 oceans in their blue economic strategy. Those are very strategic moves by any nation state. So that combination of having a policy, the combination of building trust through things like the TIP, LNG, the International Space Station, the technology, et cetera, and the success they're having with China being able to move into an equity position, if not an operatorship of the LNG, and its free movement along the Northern Sea route. All this suggests that this is, the point I'm trying to say is that this is a far more concrete relationship than people see. And the fact that if they get this right, in terms of their energy supply is secured, that they experiment in the Arctic, and it is an experiment in terms of a new world order, which is not multipolar, but is more based on multi-regional, then there's an awful lot for them to play for. And a lot of people in both countries are interested in this little capsule of the Arctic. So the true answer, if I'm honest, is I have no idea how it will go. But my view is that it has got beyond a personal relationship, and it is now of strategic value to both. So the idea that this is an axis of convenience is outdated, in my opinion, because of this trust element. And it's really now a mutual benefit, of which the LNG Yamal project is the most obvious example, is absolute mutual benefit of the integration of both those powers around the Pacific Arctic, which essentially gives China its hinterland covered by the United States and allows it to work more openly and aggressively with its plan in the Western Pacific.